little bit about me before I came into Masonry. For like the last 30, 35 years, I've been on a spiritual quest and got very involved in meditation, studying different various methods of Hinduism and Buddhism, Christian mysticism. And I really was voraciously on a path to enlightenment. And what happened is, eventually at some point, I wanted to join Freemasonry. And I was hoping that there might be something about enlightenment or about the secrets of the universe that I wasn't finding in books. And and I think also too, subconsciously, a part of me longed for more positive male support, because my dad died when I was young, and I wanted to learn how to be a gentleman in every area of my life. And so a couple of years before I became a Freemason and I petitioned the lodge, I had an experience that was extremely transformative in my life. I was going through a very rough time. I had lost my career in the mortgage business. I went through a period of 4 years from 2007 to 2011, where I literally went through 35 jobs trying to reinvent myself after losing my career. And I had a shift of awareness, and I saw with insight, not just on an intellectual level, everything that I was learning and that I had learned previously in Eastern philosophy. And this came at a very auspicious time in my life, and it changed everything. So when I entered into Freemasonry and we were going through the degrees, to be very, very honest, I didn't notice anything deep, or I just kind of concluded after I went through the degrees that I wasn't going to find any enlightenment here. I wasn't going to find material stability. I wasn't going to find the secrets of the universe. But the men in my lodge turned out to be like my best friends, and it just became something I really just wanted to be a part of. And it wasn't until I found myself going through the Holy RoyalArch, especially the fourth degree in the system, that something happened to me that made me realize that there is something much deeper, much more profound about Freemasonry. And then it was confirmed completely when I did the 14th degree in the Scottish Rite. And there, literally, my head almost spun off my shoulders, because it had to do with some words and some teachings that made me have this extreme transformation prior to that. You might even call it an enlightenment experience. And so I started to realize there's a much deeper story, much deeper insight to the first 3 degrees. And it seems like no matter how much or where I go in Masonry, and any of the concordant bodies or anything I study, it just seems to come back to the first 3 degrees. And it deepens my understanding over and over again. And so if you join a lodge and you go through the chairs, suppose you become a part of it and you drink the Kool-Aid and you really want to become a part of it. What happens is you usually start off as a steward and you progress up the line. And what starts to happen, what happened for me was, you start off very small, and you start from each chair that you move up the line. And in my lodge, I had a strong line, so it took me 8 or 9 years to go to the east to become master, which, of course, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, I'm the newest past master in my lodge, which is called someone else. So I'm no longer the current master, Lynbrook-Massapequa. But what I started to notice is when you go through the chairs, you learn a little bit more about certain aspects of things. And it increases as you go along. And it's a couple of years before you start getting much more responsibilities. And it's almost like a lodge line system manufactures either successful business owners or public servants. It really teaches you how to deal with inside of you and outside of you. And so I had this situation where I was part of a workshop that led to a lot of work outside. It wasn't Freemasonry, it was a men's group. And what we did was, they would do things like all of a sudden they call everybody to go to an American Legion out somewhere, and we had to sheetrock the basement because they had a flood. And you got to wake up early on a weekend. You'd rather be with your families, and you're doubting yourself. You're wondering why you have to go. This ain't your charity. This ain't your focus. And you get there, And, you got to make teams and stuff. And the captain of the team is supposed to hold the context and tell everybody, what to do and how to do it. And the second in the team is supposed to hold his context. And everyone's supposed to own the success of the captain of the team. And we usually winds up, it's one of the regional guys comes over and he sees the captain on his knees, banging away, working, and everyone's standing around with their hands in the pocket. And the second is yelling out orders. And then they confront everybody and they ask the person, the captain, what are you doing on your knees? You're supposed to be delegating the work to everybody else. And his reply is, these guys don't listen. I have to do everything myself. And so they would ask him, how else does it show up in your life? And he says, it doesn't. And then his team members would chime in and say, no, actually, he says this about his family and about everything else in his life. And so there was a saying in this men's group called, what a man does in one thing, he does in everything. So they would tell the guy, stand up, and they would tape his hands. They say, okay, now you got to do the captain. You can't work, your hands are taped. And then they would go to the second. What are you doing yelling out orders? You should be owning the success of your captain. You shouldn't be giving out orders. You should be holding his orders to everybody else. And then they would tape his mouth up. And so what it was it was more like a psychodrama where you were able to look inside yourself and how you behave in certain situations. And so when you're involved in a lodge, most people don't look at it this way, but I do, is I start seeing if I have any kind of authority issues, if I'm merging with anybody else, conspiring against anybody else, complaining about anybody else, not wanting to do this stuff. Because when you get to junior warden, I don't know about anybody else's lodge, but it's a lot of work in my lodge. There's a lot of meals, there's a lot of beverages to make sure it's always there. You're back and forth to the lodge. And sometimes, if you're a Diet Coke short, sometimes and the master gets mad at you, it's very easy for these little picayune things to upset people. And there's a lot of things that go on in every organization. And probably Freemasonry a lot less than most, because every man is committed to very high standards. But you start to recognize, you start to want to look inside yourself to say what it is about my personality, what it is about my own inner mechanism, what are about my unprocessed emotions that are blocking me from committing myself to the success of the lodge as best as possible. And so within itself, the exoteric tradition of the fraternity is within itself, can be looked at as a form of self-actualization. So the degrees themselves, if you look at the chart on the left and the right, this is a basic chart you'll see a lot in Masonry. You'll see the Southern, the Scottish Rite on the right, the York Rite on the left. And so when you go through the degrees, and in the concordant bodies, there's a lot of speaking of, there are some very deep, very profound virtues that happen when you go through the degree. And so this literally is supposed to raise your consciousness and attune you higher and higher and higher. Now, in some of the paths of yoga, in like karma yoga, they would say that this is creating merit and dissolving negative karma. And it really is raising your vibration, which is very necessary in the path of enlightenment. And as you increase your understanding and you go through the degrees, it really does start to resonate on higher levels of consciousness. I don't know if you've ever gone through several degrees in a row, like some of these reunions you might find either in the York Rite or the Scottish Rite, you come out very different. There's a feeling of, you feel more attuned to living higher standards and a more virtuous life. At least that's the goal. And there's also a belief. Now, there are some brothers that are into some of the spirituality of Western Africa, where they say that the passwords for each degree literally gives you entrance into that state of consciousness. And so, as we know, and this is very fringe to say on a call like this, is that, no, I'm not going to say the passwords, and it's not important to this lecture, but you don't literally have the password. Someone gives it for you. So when you become a Freemason, you literally have a friend or friends on the other side of nature. We say that a Mason is a citizen of two worlds, and we sit in lodge with the brothers that have gone before us. And so this is not unlike most of the spiritual traditions. They just don't talk about that too much in this day and age. I guess it's not popular, but they are very much there. Also, Albert Pike believed that the Kabbalah tree of life was the perfect spiritual science. Now, I'm going to make this interpretation that the Kabbalah that Albert Pike was speaking with that was more or less the Hermetic Kabbalah, which kind of was the cornerstone to the Renaissance in Europe at the time. And it really meant that Christians, Jews, and Muslims were all in this gentleman's conversation for a very long time. It wasn't until a certain time before there was a lot of persecution and it split up, and it wasn't popular to do so anymore. But the truth is, the Kabbalah was really a conversation between men seeking truth of different religions and different cultures. At least the Kabbalah that I believe Albert Pike was talking about. He also believed that the Sephirah, which are the spheres of consciousness that make up the 10 Sephirah of the Kabbalah tree of life, which they say form from the 10 utterances that God, when God created the universe, that he spoke. And every time he spoke, he created a different sphere of consciousness. Now, Pike believed that the password for certain section of degrees in the Scottish Rite were actually the keys to enter into those spheres of consciousness. Now, eventually, the Northern Masonic jurisdiction shifted the story to core values. And to be frank, a lot of values in the Southern jurisdiction also don't ascribe to Pike's theory too, because no one was ever able to map which degree was connected to which seraph of the Kabbalah tree of life. So Pike was trying to introduce Freemasonry as a profound, transformative, philosophical system that can lead a man to awakening. And so the Northern Masonic jurisdiction decided to go a different route and focus on the virtues found in these core values: reverence for God, devotion to country, integrity, justice, tolerance, and service to humanity. And of course, service to humanity in the form of charity might be the most important. Keep that in mind, because I want to come back to that. And so Carl Jung was not a Freemason, but he studied alchemy for 25 years. And he had said that at a certain point of depth with clients, he would have to cease analysis and use symbols to access the archetypes in the collective unconscious. And so it seems to me that the symbols of Freemasons, we teach in the form of symbols because we don't want to have a doctrine. We do not ascribe to any doctrine, because any doctrine can be challenged and be later on used to persecute our organization. And so we teach in symbols, one, for protection, and two, because we believe that every man deserves the right to see the truth and come to it on his own. And so the symbols allow us to interpret it for whatever our subconscious and our beliefs bring to it. So I think that this is the magnetism of Freemasonry, is when you go through the degrees and the symbols appear to you, it's your own personal, what you've traveled up to that point, how you interpret this, and also how well the Lodge does the degrees creates the polarization that magnetizes. And so if you're not prepared properly, you probably won't stay in Masonry, because you won't recognize the symbols on how important they really are. And so one of the things we do as Masons is we have a tendency to repeat things. The opening and the closing of the Lodge, we call that the ritual, including the degrees and the ceremonies. And so we have to memorize these parts, but we're not allowed to read from the book. And so we're constantly repeating these things over and over. Now, there's a word we use that you don't hear much in the ritual called inculcate. Inculcate means to learn by repetition. Now, this is strictly my own opinion. I haven't heard this from anyone, but I am a certified hypnotherapist. I don't practice that much anymore. I never really did it for a living, but I have helped people with it. And so by seeing the degrees over and over again, I believe that when you're a candidate and maybe not always as a candidate, maybe as a sideliner. In the second part of these ceremonies, there's so much inspiring information, your mind can go into sensory overload, and it becomes relaxed to the point where you're literally hypnotized. Now, I define hypnosis the way I was taught is any way we communicate with our subconscious mind. It could be as simple as driving on the highway and missing your lane. Well, you were conscious enough that if a car swerved in your lane, you'd be able to move out of the way, but yet your mind was somewhere else. And so that seems to happen. And while that's happening, your inner deeper part of your mind is absorbing all the information that's going into it. And then later on, when you see the degree over and over again, maybe people see, I've seen the degrees 40, 50, 60 times. I've been masonry for decades, and all of a sudden, they'll see something for the first time will jump out at them. Or they'll be hearing a lecture or reading a book on masonry or something else. And what was repeated in the past in the ritual will awaken them, and it'll come and you'll have that aha moment and that epiphany. It's truly an amazing thing when that happens. And so I want to get back a little bit more to enlightenment, all right? So we know that in enlightenment, we speak a lot about increasing your vibrations to reach higher states of consciousness. What's very important is internally clearing out your emotional blocks. What will happen to all of us on this path of life, whether you call it self-actualization or enlightenment, is that you can only become enlightened to the same degree that you have emotional blocks. And what I mean by that is there's a difference between feelings and emotions. Feelings are your inner truths, responding to a present situation, and your emotions are the unprocessed feelings of a lifetime that become triggered, and we lose consciousness and we just go, and we have a reaction. And so it's so important, and if you're a Mason, which I think most of us are, you'll remember a term of really what's the work of the entered apprentice is to really kind of clear this stuff out. And our work for the rest of our lives is to understand ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper so we don't have these emotional reactions. Someone once said, memory without emotion is wisdom. And I like that very much. External actualization. So the more we're able to, a lot of brothers that are very much into the esoteric part of Freemasonry, sometimes down on brothers who aren't into it, who are only into the pancake breakfasts and the lobster fests. But if you truly understand the esoteric nature of this fraternity, you'll want to do the mundane things. You'll want to roll up your sleeves and work in the kitchen. You'll want to be at the lobster fest and the pancake breakfast. You'll see all of it as the same. Everything becomes a degree. Everything becomes a ritual. Because the meaning of ritual is to make the spiritual tangible. The true purpose of ritual is to go from one state of consciousness to another. And so a little bit back to symbols, particularly the temple. The temple, as the ultimate experience, seems to be one of the most important symbols in Freemasonry. And what's interesting is you may come upon a time where you recognize one of the most profound things to realize is that you are not only the material, but you are the builder working on the material. Just want to give a few seconds to let that sink in. Remember that, because I want to deal with it in another minute or two. What seems like a different topic, I need to come to build the other side of this, is that Freemasonry is a fraternity that leads a man through two great obstacles to self-actualization: tyranny and superstition. If you think what Freemasonry has meant to society throughout the world of all time, it really does mean that. To become enlightened, you must know the secret, and you have to enlighten the world. One cannot go without the other. Freemasonry frees both the man and mankind, and I want to tell you why. First, the great and true revolutions. We call them great and true revolutions in history because they were the revolutions that took power away from extreme tyrants and gave them to the people. Incidentally, every single one of them was a Freemason behind it. Now, Freemasonry does not conspire against the government, nor does Freemasonry instigate this. It just means that the men that fought the great and true revolutions were of such high standards because they were Masons. And they were Masons because they had such high standards. And today, our greatest challenge is to recognize the pain caused by our complacency, brought on by the hard-won freedom from those who came before us. A bodhisattva in the Buddhist tradition, he will make an obligation that even if he became enlightened and earned the right to go into nirvana, he would choose rebirth and death over and over again until all sentient beings are free of suffering. There's a part in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar in particular, that says at a certain point the creation became conscious because it was taking on the attributes of the Creator, which is pure consciousness. And it realized it was being loved and fulfilled and emanated and expanded infinitely and didn't deserve it. And in a moment of shame, it pulled away from the Creator, tore the universe, and burst into 600,000 particles of life. Every human being that ever lived, that will ever live, that is alive now, are all parts of one being meant to be one with God, according to the Kabbalah. So how can one person be saved? Either we're all saved or none of us are saved. So in Freemasonry, we're working on our own enlightenment. We're also working to inspire mankind to be a more enlightened place to live. And so the secrets of Freemasonry are hidden in plain sight. And yes, I'm going to say there are secrets of Freemasonry. How in plain sight are they hidden? Right on the petition. Now in New York, we asked two questions. Do you believe in the existence of one ever living and true God? And the second, do you believe in the immortality of the soul? Who would have known? It's hidden so much in plain sight. It's literally on a petition you fill out to enter the lodge. The royal secret. All right. So the best way I can express it in words without getting expelled from the craft right about now would be this. The Lord is in his holy temple, and you are the temple. And when you know that, you know enough. Thank you, brothers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time. That is the end of the lecture. Open for any questions.